everyone, and welcome back to Through Africa. It is still me, your host, Mercy Bambela, and we're joining you again live from our studios here in Ankara, Turkey, to discuss a very important topic to the African continent, and it is the urbanization in African countries. Now, to talk about this topic in details, I'll be speaking with Sadiq Abass, who is a PhD candidate with study in urban and regional planning. Hello, Sadiq.
Hi, Messi.
Hello, and good afternoon. You're welcome to the show.
Yeah, good afternoon, and thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Now, I'd like us to, just go directly into the topic of discussion. And I'll start with this question. What do you think are the biggest challenges for our African cities due to rapid urbanization?
Okay, very good question, and thank you so much. And it's very topical, especially in this day and age. So basically, let me just start off by giving just a brief understanding, so we are all on the same page of what urbanization is. So that is a process of having our population move from our rural areas to our urban areas. And when we talk about urban areas too, we're simply looking at places that are built built up areas of contiguous settlements, with urban functions, and then with not primary economic activities. So we're talking about secondary and tertiary economic activities found within an area. So that's an urban area, of course. So when this happens, urbanization, as we are always been saying, that is, I'm talking about urban researchers, we've all agreed that it is something that cannot be stopped. So it just has to be managed and then planned well. We just have to plan towards it and then meet it head on, so that we do not incur, some of the problems that we'll be discussing now. Of course, urbanization has happened across the world, and today we are all over the world. We are all facing the problem. It comes with its own problems and then advantages. So specifically on Africa, it's interesting that even Africa as at now, when I talk of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, our urbanization rate is less than 40%, but we are having the biggest problems. So countries with over 90% urbanization, they also have their issues, their problems, but not compared to, sub-Saharan Africa. So that is the irony. We're talking about a region of the world that has that's whose urbanization is less than 40%, and yet we have all sorts of problems. So we have, cutting from transportation problems, that is traffic congestion. We're talking about housing problems. We're talking about sanitation issues. We're talking about, health issues. Unemployment. So these are, and then governance. So these are all issues that each one of them, if you decide to go into only one of them, that is a whole, topic on their own. So these are big problems that Africa is facing, is faced with. And these problems actually are caused by, as you have said in your question, by urbanization. But again, as urban researchers, we also agree that urbanization alone cannot just be the scapegoat or the reason for all of these problems that are happening in our urban areas, because there's other scholars that have argued that it's not urbanization per se, but then the lack of investment in our urban areas, and then the lack of proper planning to meet this kind of problems is also accounting for or contributing towards having these problems actually. Thank you.
Right, indeed. There are a lot of, other scapegoats that we can, pinpoint other reasons why we have all of these problems. Now, we've talked about, less investment and urbanization itself being a problem. For example, in sub-Saharan Africa, as you mentioned, which is not even, we've not even reached the 50%, urbanization scale, and then we are having all these problems. So I'd just like to ask, what do you think are lessons that Africa or African countries can learn from countries that have gone ahead of us? For example, you mentioned countries that have reached the 90%, scale. What are lessons that we can learn from them, and how should they be adopted to our local context?
Very good. Excellent. I like the end of your question, local context, yes. So the mistakes that we've always been doing is to copy from other places and try to paste it in Africa. But every problem, even though they may have certain similarities and all of that, but they are distinct and their cure or their solutions are supposed to, they are supposed to meet the local context, or they are supposed to be in agreement with what's happening on the ground at the local context. So, so countries have reached 90% and over, and now these problems, as we have mentioned, it's not like they are not also facing similar problems, but is the level and then the uniqueness or the peculiarity of the problems. So when you talk about, for example, if you take transportation issues, for instance, now countries, developed countries or countries outside of Africa that are faced with transportation problem or are still facing transportation problems have decided now we are going sustainable. Okay, we are going to implement sustainable means of transportation. So, for instance, in the 90s, in Europe, in the UK, and all of that, they were talking about, predict and then, and invest. Okay, so they try to predict the problems, the transportation problems, and then they try to and build more rules and all of that and all of that. But they realize that this is not the way to go. So they rather predict it and prevent. So how do you prevent, the problem from even occurring? So they decide to go to try to use sustainable means of transportation, especially in the urban areas. So instead of building more roads, that is investing only in one mode of transportation, you try to diversify it to more other sustainable modes of transportation. So you have the light railways, the metros, that is the underground metros or overhead metros and all of that, or the use of electric bus systems and all of that. So when it comes to dealing with, so here, African governments, they have to also make a decision. Now, we have transportation issues in your countries or in our cities. You have to make a decision and invest strategically in some of these areas. That is transportation. If you ask, I mean, from where I'm coming from, um even the basics is a problem. So we have the rules already. Even building more rules is a problem, let alone to talk of, diversifying in rail transportation or other means of transportation. The existing rules are not even well maintained. We do not have proper lighting systems at night. It's causing accidents and all of that. Now now African government have to look at these issues as big. They are issues. They have to realize that these are problems and these are solving them are supposed to lead to our own well-being. If you talk about housing, to the same thing, you know, other developed countries have had to deal with their own housing issues, slum problems, and all of that. Now, how have they solved this? Of course, they talk about inclusive zoning, okay, where the less endowed or those who do not have sufficient income to meet the affordability or the unaffordability issues related to housing, they are able to have regulations that insist that developers set aside certain percentages of their housing as social housing. And there are studies that have shown that communities or developers that have set aside between 20 to 25% or between 20 and 30% of the properties or the housing units as affordable housing units, those those developments have ended up, inuring to the benefits of the people. But when you have 5% or less than 20%, we don't really reap the true benefit of having these social housing or affordable housing within the development. And when I talk about the benefits, here we want less endowed people to be part of, to benefit from the community. That is the whole essence of even planning. So when we plan, our aim is to bridge the gap. The aim is to bridge the inequality gap in our towns and cities. You get me? So, what if we really want to have substantial impact on the people? So, where developers have, let's say, not just doing it for doing sake, but then having substantial proportion of their developments set aside for us or set aside to be meant for the less endowed people so that they also benefit. It's not like the properties there or the housing they are going to be living in will be of poorer quality than those of the rich people. Everybody has going to have similar in terms of quality, but then the pricing will differ depending on the income levels of the people. So these are some, and then in this day and age, we are talking about smart technologies and all of that. So these are areas that African governments can deliberately look at. Now, these things don't just happen out of the blue. We are not supposed to, imagine that these things, all of a sudden they will just happen. No, they have to be based on deliberate planning and then deliberate investment. You invest in the proper places so that we all benefit, so that all people in the towns and cities, urban areas, whether you are rich or poor, you benefit from what our urban areas have to offer. We talk about green planning and all of that. So basically, these are some of the things that other countries have decided to do. Even though we are not saying that they have now there are no problems anywhere, so everything is now perfect. No, there's no such a thing like that. These other countries have done it, and is beneficial to their people, and it has reduced some of the problem. Even though these problems, like I keep saying, they also exist over there, but the case of Africa is something. I mean, how can you have less than 40% urbanization, and yet you can't even house your people decently or in what we call adequate in adequate housing units. People live in slums and all of that. So these are some of the things that our governments will have to copy from the developed countries and then situate it into our local context. So by situating it to our local context, yes.
Sadiq, thank you.
Yes.
You've said a lot, on that topic. We all have to, our hands have to be on deck, and the government of our African countries need to learn from those who have done it. And even if it's not as successful as we would have loved, they have still reached a point. Now, the next question I would like to ask is also related to that. What role do you think local governments play in shaping urban and regional planning and the policies that surround it? What are the roles of these local governments, and do they even have a role at all? Do they play any roles in the forming of these policies?
Absolutely, yes. Basically, in most countries, especially in Africa, I can talk for where I'm coming from. Planning is, from even in the developed countries, planning rules are basically local government rules. So you can have the national development plans at the national level, but then the actual, when we talk about spatial planning or making decisions that affect directly the people, is done at the local level actually. They just have to be empowered to do that. So what are their rules? Of course, local governments, they have a lot of rules that they can play, and they can engage. They can also engage. They can engage in housing. So there are places that local governments are even putting up, social housing for their people. They can do, it's up to a certain skill. They can, unlike the central government that is more powerful and in terms of resources that can embark on a huge housing projects. But the local governments can also play some roles there. Now, in terms of land use regulation, they are the ones that are regulating the developments on the ground. So when people come with their, seeking permits, building permits to put up their property, they are the ones to ensure that these structures are in line with our development plans, and then these plans will inure to our benefit. They are not going to cause harm to the environment and then to the people and all of that. So land use regulation, so they can, in terms of zoning regulation, so there's what we call, I mentioned it earlier, inclusive zoning. So they can ensure that, okay, developments in their various municipalities or communities probably, set aside certain portions of these dwelling units for poorer people or people who are less endowed to also engage. And then they can also set up building codes and then design the areas to align with the national goals, and then to align with the welfare of the people. Okay, so that's for land use regulation. In terms of infrastructure development too, yes, they even though they are not as powerful as the central government, but they can also manage, they can also put up certain infrastructure or contribute to certain infrastructure like waste disposal. In fact, in many countries, waste disposal is actually a function of local governments. But in Africa, from where I'm coming from especially, it's typically the central government that tends to engage in this waste collection. Even it gives them, some resources to do that at the local level. But the main decision, the contracts and all of that, they are usually at the central level. But then the local government have to be empowered to be able to do that, to put up waste disposal infrastructure, even public transport. So public transport, in many places, actually is the municipalities that are, like we know in Turkey, for instance, they are the ones responsible for public transport. But in Africa, too, local governments can also be empowered to have proper public transport infrastructure and to run them efficiently. And then with the rules and then with our lighting systems over there. So, like I talked about housing policies already. So local governments can also get involved in housing and all of that. Community engagement, they are the ones at the local level and they are closer to the people than the central government. So they can engage the residents in. So we're looking at a planning paradigm that is participatory in nature. So the times where the planners are seen as, technicians who sit in a room and then draw plans to decide the future of cities is long gone. So we are in an era where the planning are done alongside the people. Okay. So basically, these are some of the roles that local governments can play with the environment, to the protection of the environment and all of the environmental management. So they can also, have policies or regulations to regulate, how our environments are treated, so that they're not unnecessarily polluted, or they are able to cope with, the adverse climatic conditions that may happen.
All right, there. Thank you very much, Sadiq. I think I noted one very important thing you talked about, which is public transportation, and how, the system here in Turkey is quite different from what we have in our African countries. And you saying that, I do infer that you think that something like that can be employed in our African countries. But I'd just like to ask, concerning public transport and how it's managed in most of these advanced countries, do you think it is replicable, or how effective do you think it can be in Africa?
Oh yeah, sure. It's very replicable. I mean, so like I said, you have to empower the local governments. So I say empowerment in terms of resources, financial resources specifically. I don't know for other African countries, but there are but many other countries tend to appoint their mayors. But that is something that we need to move away from. For instance, in Ghana, mayors are appointed. They are supposed to be elected So, but even though currently there are discussions going on in Ghana about elections of mayors, so there's going to be some constitutional changes maybe soon. I just hope that it's done very soon. I mean, sooner rather than later. So once you elect them, so these are the ones, they can now invest in these areas. You remember that now. These are areas that whose returns or the benefits don't come all of a sudden. They take time to come. So politicians don't tend to invest in such areas. They want areas that once they invest immediately and there's election, then people immediately see it and then they vote for them. But they hardly want to invest in areas whose benefits will come, at a future date. But once you are elected and then you want to invest in there, you have a 5-year or 4-year mandate, and it's certain nobody can remove you from your office in a year's time or 2 years' time. So once you have the guarantee or the security of tenure, you can invest in public transportation, for example, to own your own buses and to run them, and to regulate and to invite these paratransit operators to also join in, and to regulate how they manage it in terms of the routes, the fares and all of that. So these things can be done. I mean, in Africa, you just have to. We always complain about the resources that we don't have, but once that is set aside and there's that political will to do that, it can be done.
Now, I'd like us to continue, the discussion. How are African cities adapting urban planning to address climate change and environmental degradation.
Okay. So, we are in a situation where, sustainability has emerged to become our guiding principles for all governments around the world. And then many African countries to have also sign up to some of these global goals. So we're talking about the sustainable development goals. Okay. So, and as part of that, we have 17 goals in all, and then each one of them is looking at specific areas. So when we talk about climate adaptation plans for African governments, so there are the adverse climatic issues that are facing Africa in terms of flooding, heat and all of that, like heat, that's hot weather, droughts, so it's affecting almost everything. So droughts affecting, and then flooding and all of this affecting our agricultural production, and then also the livelihoods of people in terms of people having to seek shelter during these disasters. So African governments, well, some of them are looking at. I don't know for a specific, in specific, like in terms of specific actions that are currently being taken. But what we know is that governments around Africa have realized they need to set up or to put up or to embark on certain strategies to mitigate flooding. For example, in Accra, we've always had flooding almost every year. And there are certain times that it has taken lives, unfortunately. So, and we've always been talking about these things. So, governments have, looking at preventing people from putting up structures along waterways, and also we're talking about energy adoption, renewable energy adaptation, the use of renewable sources of energy for our cities. We talk about hydroelectric, So these are some of these things that governments may want to consider, and eco-friendly or environmentally friendly modes of transportation. So you realize that all throughout for so long, it's like we've allowed the private sector alone to be dictating or to be serving the people. They are serving the transport needs of the people. So it's about time that governments also deliberately engage or involve themselves in transportation so that they are able to embark on sustainable or to invest in sustainable modes of transportation. We talk about also waste management innovations. Okay, so these are areas that governments will want to look at. Like I said, these problems keep coming because concrete steps have not been taken to prevent them. And then we are all aware of, like, it's something that we are all aware of, climatic, the adverse climatic conditions that is happening, global warming and all of that. But even areas that are as basic, very little is done. So these things seem abstract to a lot of African governments, but these are the realities. So once your country or your urban areas have always been faced with flooding, and then fires and all of that, droughts, that's maybe sometimes we hear on the news that this rainfall, it has never, the last time it's happened was so many years ago. Then you can tell that yes, indeed, the climate change is real. It's kind of real, and that we need to put in these specific measures. So we need to innovate in terms of our waste disposal. So the question arises: what do we do with plastic bags? We have to take steps, or we have to take tough decisions regarding plastic bags. It's very rampant in Africa. So now you drop it, and then it goes to choke these drains. And when there is even the slightest of rainfall, then you have the kind of problems that we are having. So these issues with still on drainage. Okay, I don't know for other countries, but I realized that it's only in Africa that we have open drains. So these are all areas that we need to focus our attention to. And sometimes politicians invest in electric buses. Fine, it's good. But the infrastructure to run these things. And these are not things that should just be done for doing sake. They have to be done deliberately to ensure that we really benefit from doing them, not doing them for the sake of doing them. So yeah, flood management, renewable energy adoption, environmental friendly modes of transportation, even in our housing sector, to the same thing. We need to adopt sustainable, sustainable principles in our housing, development, in our waste disposal and waste management. And so basically, these are some of the things that I would like to talk about.
Indeed, Abbas, Sadiq Abass, thank you for that. You've mentioned a lot of the ways that we can work things out, and you talk specifically about eco-friendly mode of transportation, and then you talked about our use of plastic bags mainly. I think for taking Nigeria as an example, and I think this is applicable to Ghana too. Most people have this plastic water bags, and when they do consume the content, they are thrown in places, and it is such a sight. It is such a bad sight to behold. And I think as a continent, we can definitely do better. I will Still on that topic, let's talk about environmental conservation. How can we conserve our environment? How can we keep climate change, there's been a lot of talks on climate change. How can we conserve our climate? And how can African countries in specific balance, industrial growth, I will talk about urbanization to industrial growth, with environmental conservation?
That's that's another interesting topic to talk about. So since the Industrial Revolution, the developed world have embarked on a certain path to develop themselves, to industrialize and all of that. But at a point, they realize that going this way is only causing more harm to the environment and all of that. So the developing countries are now advised not to go their way, but to go another way in order to save our planet. So the whole discussion on environmental conservation, it has to be linked back to the same issue of sustainable development, because these are issues that initially started from environmental point of view. But of course, now we know that sustainable development encompasses three areas. So there's also the issue of social and cultural preservation. Okay, and then we talk about economic efficiency. So now we are developing, like African countries are developing. We want to industrialize, but we do not want to go the way. And what was the way of the developed countries? The over dependence on fossil fuels mainly. So we do not want to depend so much on fossil fuels. We want to run away from the use of fossil fuels to the use of more sustainable, energy sources, like the wind power or the sun, the solar power, and all of that, hydro. Now, Africa. So there are countries that have, you want to invest in more of hydro power to power your industries, and then Africa is also known to have most of these, mineral resources. So we do not want to keep them under the earth. We want to use them, but at the same time, while we are using them now, we also want to ensure that future generation also get the benefit of these things. Maybe it's in sub-Saharan Africa that that you have mining towns that are really deprived. Mining cities that are supposed to be the places where these precious minerals are extracted, they are supposed to also to benefit more from these resources. So in removing this and extracting and exploiting these resources, we need to do that such that we do not destroy the environment. So there are more sustainable ways of mining. So once you clear the areas, then there are talks of reforestation, planting more of the trees to return the places to their original forms in terms of green cover, in terms of the forest cover. So we also can also talk about filling of these places where after digging them and all of that. Okay, there's in recent times too. There's also talk of what we call circular economies. So circular economy basically is just an economy that depends on or that puts more weight on efficiency, prevention of wastages. So we talk of recycling. So once you produce, factory A produces a product. So this product, after the use of the product, we do not it doesn't become waste. So the end product, or let's say a bottle of water, for instance. So after drinking the water, the container doesn't become waste, but then it serves also as a raw material for another type of product that can also be of benefit to the people. So this called circular. So it goes in circular form. So recycling, and then we use that product again. And when that product is also consumed, then that can also be used for something else. So these are areas that we can explore and to ensure that we balance our industrial growth, and then we also preserve our environment. We don't want to, just be developing and be mindless of the environment. To get to a point that future generations will not be able to also benefit from the environment that we are all benefiting from. Thank you.
Definitely. Thank you there. Um, we need to always think about, our future. Now, one last question, final question there. What role does technology play in improving urban planning in Africa? There's been a lot of talks on, AI and artificial intelligence now. And Africa is also being affected by this discussion. So what role is technology playing in all of this, and how is Africa being affected?
Yes, that's also good. Um, yeah, so Africa, we have issues with even our land boundaries, demarcation, and all of that. We don't we also have issues with like we mentioned before, flooding and all of that. So all these things, if you're finding it difficult to even to predict or to know that there's going to be heavy downpour on this date and all of that, or even we are even finding it difficult to properly demarcate our land borders in terms of internal, like land boundaries, to avoid conflicts and to promote development on the land. Then there are technologies that can assist, and then yes, countries have adopted some of these things like GIS and remote sensing. So with GIS, it's a very powerful tool. You can use that for even for transportation management, and then the transportation research and all of that, and for transportation infrastructure development. So for land demarcation and all. So that's GIS and remote sensing. And it's very effective. Planners are really using it for in their works in Africa. We talk about smart mobility solutions, so that you know exactly where the next, like for instance in Ghana there is Bolt, and I believe in so many other countries there are these apps that call them mobility as a service. So these are areas that so use the technology to solve problems that the people in urban areas are faced with. So I talk about GIS in land demarcation and land registration, all of that. So we digitalize all of these things. We put them in digital formats using these technologies, and to be able to enhance, transparency, and then in land dealings. Because if there's no security in the land, how do we find investors wanting to come to invest in the land? So the land has to be digitalized, to be transparent to, so we know who owns what, and then what interest the person has in specific lands, so that investors, when they come to buy their land, those lands, and then they invest heavily on that land, the next day no one comes to tell them that this land belongs to me and not the other person you bought it from. So there's a reason why so many, we do not, like the foreign direct investment, or maybe investing in land itself in Africa, is at a very slow pace. It shouldn't be an issue. Who owns what issue? Once you get into the digital platform, you should be able to tell all of this. And these are there are technologies that can help us do that, and then we should be focusing our attention on those things. And in terms of even our electricity metering system, or waste transportation lines, like sewage lines, so when there's a leakage, there are systems that are able to send signals to report, so that if immediately action is taken to avoid wastage, or to avoid epidemics, whatever. So if it's waste line, and then there's there's a leakage somewhere, so that it prevents certain health hazards. And if it's water lines or drinking water lines too, it also avoids wastages. So it sends signals with the sensors in place and all of that. So these are technologies that we can use in our urban development in Africa. And it doesn't mean that we don't have to develop yes, it's good we develop our own technologies, but in a situation where you do not have those technologies, these technologies are available elsewhere. You can import them. You are importing other commodities. So why can't you import technology when you know the technology is going to be of benefit to you? And then as you also develop your own local content or local technology and all of that. So and I believe our colleagues out there who are experts in these areas and are closer to governments and are able to advise them and to embark on concrete solutions that will directly affect the lives of people in urban areas. I think that it will be a very good starting point for the future of urban areas in Africa.
All right, there, Abubakar Sadiq Abass, PhD candidate with study in urban and regional planning. Thank you very much for coming on the show today and for sharing your time and your knowledge with us. We do appreciate.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure being on your platform too, and I also appreciate it. Hoping to return again some other times.
Thank you very much, and you're welcome. And with that, we've come to the end of today's show. It is still me, your host, Mercy Bamgola, and this is Through Africa. To send us questions and suggestions, you can always do so on our WhatsApp number, which is always on the screen. And with that, I'll see you in the next one. Till then, stay safe and goodbye.